Okay, this is a review of Chapter 10, Social Media, for Soc 2 Social Problems. So what is the media? The media refers to different channels of communication. So we have the mass media, which refers to the means to transmit information from a single source to a vast number of people. Mass media outlets such as radio stations or newspaper publishers create content that reaches a vast audience. So under this heading of the mass media, you have newspapers, which came about after the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, and created the possibility for a new mass medium. By about 1800, newspapers in some European cities reached a circulation of over 1 million people. Radio also was invented in the late 1800s, and soon wireless transmission was used on land and sea. And then, of course, television. Commercial television broadcasting began in 1928, and by the 50s, most homes in the U.S. had at least one television set with programming from 3 major networks: NBC, ABC, and CBS. So obviously a lot has changed since the advent of the mass media. Now we have the influence of social media. So where mass media transmits information in a single direction, social media links millions of people in an interactive network which information flows in all directions. Social media emerged only after the development of computers and the internet. In a world shaped by the Cold War, the initial purpose of the internet was to serve as a decentralized communication system, linking computers with no centralized broadcasting point vulnerable to military attack. Obviously now it's a place where we can look at cat memes, right? So anyway, when it comes to the media, we'll talk about the issues of, who controls the media, who owns the media, how media is framed, and things of this nature that affect the kind of messages that we receive and the ways in which we're either informed or misinformed. So when it comes to media and the message, the technology that we employ in our society shapes the way we understand the world. So Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan said that media not only transmits information, but also shapes the message. So the development of the mass media changed the character of human relationships, right? And the clearest way to see this is that we all interact with thousands of people we never see through these social media platforms. So social media and computer technology have also changed the character of the workplace, making our jobs less personal, just as various media has changed our quality of leisure pursuits. So media shapes our reality. What's presented in the news in terms of these kind of news bites or sound bites inevitably shapes the reality that's presented. Right? The fact that people who turned into the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon presidential debate on the radio had a different assessment than those who watched it on television illustrates the power of the media to shape the message. And that's something I've looked at in my own research with politics and media, is just how much media perceptions affect your support for certain candidates, right? So that's just one way the media shapes our reality for us. Through the media, you get a certain message, and it's being shaped by those who are framing the conversation. So I put some information in the additional materials for this week on media framing by Noam Chomsky from his kind of famous work, Manufacturing Consent, that talks about the ways in which the media kind of controls and affects our consent for things, right? And really kind of manipulates us with advertising. So anyway, when it comes to media bias, obviously in recent years, you have Trump, along with other conservatives and alt-right media outlets that claim that the mainstream media has a liberal bias, right? But as a lot of people often say, the media is only as liberal as the corporations that own it. So people like Bernie Sanders and those speaking for the left claim that large media corporations don't really challenge the status quo, that they often report things and create a sense of life that reflects that of the dominant groups in society. So research shows that some outlets like Fox News and the Wall Street Journal are much more conservative, while other outlets like the New York Times or National Public Radio are more liberal or progressive. But not all media bias is political. Media outlets select stories and present them in ways that attract an audience in order to increase profits. It's really about money, and that's, again, part of what they talk about in Manufacturing Consent. So basically, sometimes the content of the shows will actually reflect that of the needs of the advertisers, right? Or the famous case, I think I already talked about that in class before, about the kind of Monsanto v. Fox News situation where they figured out that these hormones were being used in milk, and then there was, a certain amount of antibiotics getting into the milk, And when they tried to publish the story and present it on television, they were shut down by their network, largely because there was, Monsanto was a corporate sponsor of that network. So oftentimes the advertisers are dictating the content because that's how they make money in the system, is to, play to advertising, because that's really what pays for media to happen, right? So media literacy, moving on, refers to the capacity to be a critical consumer of the media. It involves discerning what messages are being presented, assessing the source of information, and using multiple outlets to assess the degree of bias. So the digital divide refers to the disparities in access to the internet for various categories of people around the world or within a nation. About half the world's people are using the internet and half are not. So the share of any nation's population that's using the internet is correlated with that nation's level of economic development, and in some cases, the degree to which the government controls access to information. And there's a map about this in the book. So within the US population, age is the strongest predictor of internet use. Whereas 99% of young adults use the internet, just about 60% of people over the age of 65 do use the internet. Okay, so when it comes to social media and problems for the individual, when it comes to presentation of self, social media plays an important part in the process of what Erving Goffman called the presentation of self. So Goffman was looking at this through this kind of symbolic interactionism frame, that we make meaning when we interact with each other. So Goffman's analysis focused on face-to-face interactions, but in a cyber world, we present ourselves using these online apps that transmit a very carefully crafted identity to an audience, right? So basically, on our social media platforms, we put out the best version of ourself, right? The self that we present online is our idealized self that we use after careful editing, right, of the words, of the images that present and distort the reality. And so what's interesting with this Goffman take is that obviously, it kind of goes with his sense of what he called impression management, which is that we want to manage the way that other people see us. So we want people to have a favorable view of us, right? So part of this is done through, the editing of photos, or, just the kind of way that people force these photos in, like every time they go out to eat, they have to take a picture of their dinner or whatever it might be. And what's interesting, though, is Goffman would never have been able to understand how we could only interact through these forums, meaning oftentimes we know less about the person in real life and more about them through their social media platform, which again is just a presentation of self. It's just what they want us to think that they are, not necessarily who they actually are, right? So it's interesting how social media, the self-image that we have that comes through this, we build our self-image imagining how others see us. And so parents and peer groups, all these people influence our self-image, but in a digital age, in response, we're, changing to receive that, positive like, or, basically getting more likes or clicks or follows or retweets or whatever it is on social media is also shaping how we see ourselves. So for those who use social media, negative feedback, for example, receiving few likes, carries the risk of feeling rejection and even experiencing clinical depression. So when it comes to social media and empathy, research shows that the extent of the use of social media, when it replaces our face-to-face interactions, this can affect individuals' experiences and give them a reduced capacity for empathy, or the ability to imagine ourselves in another person's shoes. So Sherry Turkle documented a decline in empathy among today's young people compared to those of an earlier generation. And a lot of research is connecting that link to, again, the missed interactions in a face-to-face level. That's when we realize that we have more in common than we have differently. But especially through social media, we have these platforms that they actually create a kind of tunnel vision for us about what the world is like. And the algorithms often can increase more hostility, more anger. So that's something I think I'm actually going to add to your additional resources, was this research study that was done about having anti-trans posts or following people that are known for basically like hating trans people, and how quickly the algorithm then provided other hateful groups to the researchers, and it was a pretty quick shot straight from anti-trans videos to anti-gay and lesbian videos to anti-women to then white supremacy. So it's just an interesting phenomenon that the algorithm gives us more things that are similar to what we've already watched, right? And it really kind of creates these separate worlds for ourselves so that we kind of end up in this echo chamber where everything that we see reflects what we think. And so it can really warp our perception of what other people think and do. And so it creates these kind of us versus them things, right? When in reality, even the like worst person, you got something in common with, right? And so when we don't have as many face-to-face interactions, there's less of that opportunity to connect and see ourselves and each other. Through social media, it's difficult to do that because, like I said before, we're presenting kind of a fake, slick image of ourselves and not the real person, right? So this can affect our capacity for empathy. When it comes to social media and conformity, all other research has looked at our tendency to conform to attitudes and behaviors of those around us. So a UCLA study found that subjects that assessed photos that were presented with more likes that they thought that those photos were better than photos that had fewer likes. So just even kind of glancing at how many other people have liked something affects whether or not we will like it. So conformity in that way of just we will follow along with the crowd, we will go along with the group. And so this again affects our individuality and our ability to kind of stand apart within a crowd. So when it comes to social media multitasking and attention span, social media enhances our ability to engage in multitasking, which is engaging more than one physical or mental activity at a time, right? So multitasking may boost productivity theoretically, but it really distracts us, right? It actually can be dangerous, especially in the case of like texting and driving a car, like every person on the road seems to be doing, because every time I turn around while I'm driving, boom, someone's on their damn phone. But anyway, it might seem more productive that you can text and drive, but maybe don't, right? But what's actually interesting is there's this phenomenon where researchers basically conclude that social media reduces our attention span. And what's interesting about multitasking is there's actually this research that came out and they call it multi-slacking. This idea that we're often on multiple devices at once, but we're not actually paying full attention to any of them. So we're not actually being more productive. It would take us less time if we just focus on each thing individually, right? But it's just the fact that we think we're being productive through multitasking, but really it's multi-slacking. Moving on. Cyberbullying, another issue, refers to the use of the internet to embarrass, abuse, or manipulate other persons. So this is a huge phenomenon where kids that often, if they were bullied at school, now it never leaves because they go home and the bullying is still there, right? It happens all the time. And so this can be a very problematic thing for a lot of kids, and this is what has led to, many self-harming events or suicides for young people, because they feel like they can't escape it. Like even if they move away, the social media platforms are connected to them, and basically it feels as if it's a bullying you can't escape, right? So social media also has connections to depression, right? Research shows that teens who use social media for more than 3 hours a day are 1/3 more likely to experience feelings of hopelessness and depression and report thoughts of suicide than teens that are not using social media, at least are using social media for less than 2 hours a day. So just even the amount of time you're on the platform can affect your mental health and well-being. And social media is also connected to addiction. So research supports the conclusion that the use of social media carries a risk of addiction. In part, the risk follows from any activity that stimulates the pleasure center of your brain. But basically, the producers of social media have intentionally designed their products with the goal of maximizing user engagement, which often means kind of addictive properties that make sure that you check back over and over and over, right? Like when Instagram went down for like a minute, everybody lost it, right? Because they're like, what am I supposed to do with my time? And everyone went to Twitter. But basically, oftentimes it's an addiction. It's very difficult for people to step away from these platforms. And you hear these things of people talking about, I'm going to take a break from social media or things like that. because oftentimes it's just a way to kind of reconnect with the actual world around us and not this digital world we've created for ourselves. So when it comes to social media, there's also problems for relationships, right? First, it changes the importance of physical location. So it allows us to connect to a far larger number of people than ever before because we're not creating social ties just based on a physical bounded community. Social media makes it so that we can connect with people all over the world, right? But there are positives to that because you can find your community, you can find your people, but there are some downsides to that as well, as it affects the kind of nature of localized communities as people aren't connecting because they're looking at their damn phone. When it comes to social media and parenting, the use of social media allows parents to have far greater knowledge about a child's location and activities than was, available before. I mean, not to mention the fact you can literally track their phones. So, but parents, if they're doing their job right, they're going to monitor their child's online activity. They're going to, kind of make sure that the kids are being safe because there's a lot of predators that use these platforms and, often try to target or harm children because they're still developing and they're not as savvy about when they're being manipulated, right? And through social media, you can be anybody. So they can pretend to be a kid's friend and actually be a predator, right? So that's a good transition to predators. It's a serious danger to young people, right? When using social media are predators. So the way it works is they typically forge some sort of relationship online and, over time develop a bond, and then they eventually convince the young person to meet with them in person. And this can, lead to sexual victimization. So it's very, very troubling. When it comes to social media and dating, there's an increase in the share of dating apps that are available, right? Dozens of them at this point. So, but in the same way as you would with any other social media, people have to treat the information posted on those sites as suspect because it's created by the individual. There's no ability to triangulate that information using other sources. So, for example, if you were going to have, in the past, if you were having a blind date, usually your friend has vetted this person. They're like, okay, he doesn't look like an axe murderer, and you guys have stuff in common, right? But nowadays, it's whatever kind of catfished image we put up on social media or through these kind of dating platforms is what you're interacting with. And when it comes to likes and dislikes, all of these things, it's very easy to manipulate. So online relationships can lead to marriage more quickly than those that are formed in other ways if those people meet online for a while and kind of get to know each other that way. And it's interesting that couples who meet online and marry are also 3 times more likely to divorce than couples who meet in more conventional ways. And so part of that might have to do with the social ties related to how people meet in conventional ways, right? So if you meet someone that's a friend of a friend, right, having a similar friend group, having that kind of connection to a larger community can also enhance your relationship. So it's interesting how social media can help us find love, but oftentimes, at least statistically, people are much more likely to divorce in those kind of meetings as well. So the use of social media really distracts from our face-to-face relationships. So even when we are in person with others, we're always looking at our damn phones. We're always worried about what's going on out there. It's like that FOMO thing of the fear of missing out, that we're always trying to oh, what am I missing? What could be going on while I'm sitting here at dinner with this lovely person that I should be paying attention to, right? And the people that use more social media, especially within couples, this is a big source of relationship conflict, right? Where, if you're trying to spend quality time with each other, but the other person's just on social media the whole time, it's very difficult to connect. So some more issues with social media, problems for society. So the increasing use of social media is affecting our culture. And one problem is the high level of online violence, which again desensitizes us and numbs us to the horror of real violence in our lives. And this can encourage other people to engage in violence. And so, or maybe those challenges where it's oh, TikTok challenge, go slap a teacher, right? That encourages these horrible, things. And a lot of the content on social media glorifies risk, right? Like the stupid walking up a thing of milk crates or things like that, right? And so critics of social media suggest that this content can encourage others to engage in a lot of those same risky behaviors. So this kind of connects to the shallow culture hypothesis. Critics claim that expanding the use of social media encourages a superficial and morally shallow way of life. And research links heavy use of social media to young people valuing physical beauty, making money, and being popular as being the most important things. So maybe the way that we're promoting these things through social media and the way that we're interacting with them over and over is making us more and more shallow. So when it comes to social media and work, now social media is a major tool for, capitalism and corporations. So not only does computer technology allow employers to monitor the behaviors of workers and do all these things, but sometimes the stupid crap you put on social media can actually affect your job. You can lose your job, right? Or some people have jobs doing social media for companies. So, it's really interesting how much work, especially capitalism, has jumped up on the idea of, hey, if people are on social media, then we want to be there selling them crap. And of course, when it comes to social media and politics, social media is widely used by political leaders to try to influence public opinion, right? Again, it's where people are, so meet them where they are. So President Trump is well known for his tweets. I mean, at least he was until they banned him, right? So it's common nowadays that political candidates will make use of all sorts of different platforms in order to try to reach voters. And of course, Trump just did this in a much different way than people before. You didn't have a president that had their own personal Twitter account until him, tweeting at 4 a.m. from the toilet or whatever it might be. So, also when it comes to politics, this is also how we hear about a lot of people and candidates, and that can also be problematic because if we're in a echo chamber created by an algorithm, then we're only hearing about certain candidates and in certain frames, right? So also when it comes to social media and problems involving information, managing and controlling information is a problem, right? We know that people used Facebook, in order to try to sway opinions about the 2016 election. We know that there's been a lot of bots, right, created just to create misinformation about certain candidates or policies and people. And this is extremely problematic because a lot of people receive the information they get on social media without context and often just accept it because they know the person that's giving them the information. So people will stop trusting media sources themselves, but trust their random Uncle Larry that never got out of 7th grade because he posted a thing, right? And you see this a lot in regards to the COVID-19 thing, or just even the vaccine itself. This idea of no, I'm going to do my own research, and it's just people sharing misinformation on Facebook. But this is extremely problematic when it comes to how do we have reliable sources of information that people trust, especially in a public health crisis. Okay, when it comes to theories in social media, structural functional theory is looking at the functions of social media. So functional theory for functionalism is going to identify 6 functions of mass media and social media for the operation of society. 1, social media is an agent of socialization. It's something that influences us and our patterns and habits and behaviors. 2, social media advances a very uniform culture. It creates that conformity and really has strong presence of those hegemonies, right? Those hierarchies we've talked about who should have power, who's important, who's not. 3, social media increases social integration, theoretically. 4, social media is an agent of social control. It controls a lot of what we see and what we think, right? 5, social media is a source of entertainment for a lot of us, right? It's also a source of stability. It's something to do, right? To scroll through. And social media, lastly, 6, is a source of change. It can be a very important touch point, for things like, let's say, the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter, to have these platforms in order to organize and advance the causes of equality in society. So symbolic interaction theory is looking at social media and the construction of reality, right? So kind of going back to that Goffman idea. Symbolic interaction theory highlights how social media is central to the social construction of reality in everyday life. News reports, for example, are selective that are shaped by political viewpoints and, of course, a company's desire to increase their audience, which is, again, why I can't stress enough, you should be using sources of publicly funded media and not corporate mainstream media. So corporate media is only going to be as open with its viewpoints as the advertisers allow it to be and the owners of that company allow it to be, right? And this kind of leads right into social conflict theory, because they look at social media and inequality, right? And really, look at how social media, from a Marxist perspective, has a big problem with media consolidation, right? So media organizations are these large profit-seeking corporations. But over time, the share of all media outlets owned and controlled has been narrowed to a very small number of individuals and corporations. So this is what we call media consolidation. So right now, over 90% of all media is controlled by a handful of corporations. So basically everything you watch on television, see in films, hear on the radio, see in billboards, see on social media, right, are all controlled by a handful of corporations. So of course that's going to affect kind of our even understanding of the world, how things work, and our concepts of reality, right, when it's being so controlled. And you have to think about, well, who owns those corporations? What messages are they trying to send to the culture? We know media is a very powerful influencer, especially because the less social interactions we have, the more media becomes that important touch point to kind of give us a reality that we live in. So especially when it comes to how media portrays stereotypes or things of this nature, or inequality, can be very important, because if you don't know people within certain communities, you can believe the stigma on television. So for example, for many years, gays and lesbians were basically, portrayals of them were restricted from all media sources. And then once some of the portrayals did happen, they were, horrible caricatures of people, like not real representations. And so what this does is, if you know someone in your own life that's LGBTQ, it's easier to be like, oh, that stereotype is stupid because that's not how so-and-so acts, and I know that how they are. But if so many people didn't know anyone that, because again, we live in very segregated lives and communities, didn't know anyone that was LGBTQ, it's easier to believe the stupid stereotype through the media, because that's the only reference point you have for that interaction. Right? So it's important what messages are sent through the media, but often, especially through media consolidation, where only a handful of companies control all of our media, almost all of our media, over 90% of our media, again, why it's important to use those kind of non-corporate listener-sponsored medias, right, like KPFK or things of this nature, because otherwise you're just getting a very controlled image that's coming from the major corporations themselves, that are going to sell to you what the news is, what reality is, in a way that makes you buy more of their stuff, in a way that makes you not critical of their business practices, right? So this really, it becomes a farce when we talk about it being news, because they're really not giving us the news. They're often giving us little, tidbits or snapshots, but they're not giving us any of the context, any of the long-term understanding, or any of those kind of things that provides an understanding for society that we used to rely on through the media, right? Especially when it comes to things like politics. How do we know about political candidates? It used to be through the media. But nowadays, it's so difficult to get any clear information, because it's all about the horse race. It's all about, oh, this person's up 2 points or down 2 points, or here's a sound bite from this person, or here's their tweet, but not like, let's play their entire speech. Let's talk about what are their platform issues. What are the kind of policies they're bringing to the table? We don't talk about that anymore. And so that becomes very problematic, because people don't really know what they're voting for or against anymore. It's more about the personality than anything. So feminist theory also looks at social media and gender, and looks at how social media is linked to gender stratification, as media content both reflects inequality based on gender and also helps perpetuate that inequality by kind of creating this world where women are only decorative objects and not people. Okay, when it comes to constructing problems and defining solutions, there's a wide range of media. And so there's a kind of range of how people interpret this, right? And so the media plays an important role in how we come to define our social problems. So how one views the media depends on their position on the political spectrum. So those on the far right believe in honoring tradition. So from a conservative point of view, mass media and social media are essential to an organized social life involving more than 300 million people. At the same time, media can direct attention away from traditional culture, as they argue that most young people spend too much time on their smartphones, more so than they do interacting with their parents or teachers. And conservatives also claim that types of mainstream media have a liberal bias. So from a far-right point of view, critics of mass media point to media's silence about what they see as cultural and economic decline of the United States. For liberals, it's about supporting a progressive agenda. So from a liberal point of view, mass media and social media can do and support a progressive agenda by calling attention to inequality and supporting the formation of social movements that can bring about change, right? Like I was saying before, the formation of the Me Too movement in opposition to sexual assault is one example, or the formation of the Black Lives Matter movement that really did start on these social media platforms. Obviously, there's real people and real movements behind these platforms, but this is a way that people can then organize themselves. So the radical left looks at media, especially social media as well, as big business, right? From a far left point of view, major media outlets are large, privately owned corporations. And some of these corporations support progressive causes, but most of them do not, right? Most of these corporations are unlikely to challenge the capitalistic system itself that gave them that power and dominance. So, for example, Sinclair Broadcasting Group, this corporation with conservative political leanings, owns and controls some 200 television stations in the U.S., with programming in about half of all U.S. households. And what's interesting is John Oliver did a great bit on this on his Last Week Tonight show, showing how Sinclair Broadcasting Group, sorry, I don't know why I couldn't spit that out, that they basically mandate what is reported across all the networks. So they just give copy to the reporters. So instead of the reporters creating a newscast based on the local area, they're told, read this exact wording. And it becomes very like Orwellian 1984 when you see dozens of people repeating the exact wording. It's very, it kind of is more reminiscent of how media systems work in totalitarian societies that try to really control this message and have a uniformed message. So, if you want to know more about the Sinclair Broadcasting example, I really suggest watch that John Oliver episode. You can watch John Last Week Tonight on YouTube, and how he gets into Sinclair and how kind of menacing it is. So going on from here, the expansion of mass media and the emergence of social media have greatly increased access to information, including words, images, and music. But people now, they have more connectivity than ever before. Whether this is actually going to create more connection is a whole nother problem, right? Will this power enhance democracy? Or will it just provide more power to elites to remain to be seen, to be the people creating the conversation and having more of a voice? So even though social media can be an equalizer because we all have one platform, there's still ways to give us like blue checks or things like that to kind of differentiate us from others. So there's still little doubt that social media supports the formation of social movements and seek change. So it's very important to have these kind of platforms as well. So as on one end, they can be creating harm to us personally, creating social harm, but also they can create social good. It really depends on how you use these platforms, right? So this connectivity can either be something that we organize how much we want to make society better, or it can be a place where like Nazis organize, or people that are, white supremacists or things like that. So there's a give and take there about the kind of positives and negatives. And social media companies have really won over younger generations. They are kind of expanding into older generations as well, especially through like Facebook and things like this. But as generations age, newer and newer apps will probably come out to accommodate those younger generations that don't want to be on like the old people platforms of Facebook or Instagram or any of these things. And so it's just interesting that how we relate to each other is important in a society. How we connect is important. So giving people opportunities to connect is great, but we also have to think about what some of these consequences are. So if we have good media literacy, if we know how to unplug once in a while and just go walk through some trees, maybe we can have both connection through the social media and still mental stability in a good society. We're just going to have to work for it.